As I was sitting there listening during the first panel, I thought about many experiences in my own life where people have come to my door. I thought about when I lived in the United Kingdom, and my next door neighbor, who was a Muslim from Pakistan, invited my wife and I over for dinner with him and his family, and they shared their faith with us and tried to tell us about what was great about Islam and listened about our faith as well. But this panel is specifically about the policy implications. And let me mention four to foreshadow some of the comments from this panel. One of those political implications has to do with human rights. And one of the panelists has talked about, and I think we'll hear about in their remarks, about balancing converging human rights considerations, such as the individual right to free speech and conscience on the one hand, and the rights of indigenous communities on the other. A second political implication that we'll hear about is whether or not there's a rationale for some sort of international regulation on missionary activity. Third is the question about what should U.S. foreign policy be with regards to defending its citizens abroad. Many of us have watched this story in Haiti about U.S. citizens who took, as missionaries, who took children or were trying to take children out of the country ostensibly to an orphanage. And what should the U.S. government do on behalf of its citizens when there's this mixture of proselytism, of faith, of law? And then fourth, let me juxtapose two positions. One of our panelists has written that there's a misperception of intentions when the U.S. engages in the Muslim world, that there's an unfortunate reputation of missionaries mopping up after military intervention in the Muslim world. Contrast that viewpoint with those who would say that the U.S. has been the greatest friend to human rights in the region possible. It was the U.S. who helped liberate Muslims in Bosnia and then in Kosovo. It was the U.S. who's been on the side of Muslims in Darfur and called it genocide. It was the U.S. who played a strong role in liberating Muslims in Afghanistan and Iraq from tyranny. Juxtapose those very two different positions about the implications, the perceptions of U.S. intent in the greater Muslim world. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it to our first speaker for today, Salam al-Mariotti, who's the executive director of the Muslim Political Action Committee. The mission of MPAC is that it's an American institution which informs and shapes public opinion and policy by serving as a trusted resource to decision makers in government, media, and policy institutions. And it's committed to developing leaders with the purpose of enhancing the political and civic participation of American Muslims. You can see from the biography in your booklet that he has a lengthy resume of speaking and written appearances over the past 20 years. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Salam al-Mariotti.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Tom Farr for inviting me for this very important panel and discussion on proselytism and religious freedom. I'd like to define the problem a little differently. I don't think the problem is religion and religious witnessing, sharing, proselytism, or conversion. I think the problem is ideological proselytism. And ideological proselytism has a narrow view of the world that is being imposed on others to homogenize cultures to a set of views by a power or a group that is trying to convert people to their narrow ideology that does not serve public interest or human rights, but serves their political interests or special interests. And I think we have to broaden the issue of proselytism. And many times, ideological proselytism takes on a religious veneer or a religion. And I think the case in Iran, for example, is a perfect illustration of that point, where the dissent is coming from the people, meaning that the governing body is not really representing the public interest, but a narrow ideological point of view. If you, as has been stated before, there is no compulsion in matters of faith that comes directly out of the Quran. So if you impose Islam, then it is not Islam anymore. By the same token, if you impose democracy, it is not democracy anymore. So there's a difference between trying to reform and advance human rights on the one hand, and trying to homogenize a group of people to a narrow points of views that is really only serving one class or one religion, or more accurately, one group within a religion. Because when we look at religious conflicts in the world, there are more intra-faith conflicts than there are interfaith conflicts. Yes, there are problems, obviously, in interfaith conflicts, but if we look in Pakistan, the majority of the problems are between Sunni and Shia and Ismaili and Ahmadis and so on and so forth. And the same for most of the Muslim world for that matter. And I believe the same issues occur within Christianity among its different denominations. Having said that, I do believe that religion plays an instrumental role in advancing human rights, because you cannot believe in one God without believing in one human family and without having that conviction to advance the interests of human dignity and human rights. So the belief in one God and human rights are inseparable. And in my opinion, they are a means to achieving liberation, justice, and decency in our society and throughout human history. And again, in our religion, the final point to us is, as the Quran says, to you be your religion and to me be my religion. And also, the Quran elaborates on that point. It says, to each of you, we, God, has made a different law and a different way. And if it were God's will, he would have made you into one community. He could have made you into one community, but he tests you differently with the different circumstances you are presented with. Therefore, compete for doing good work. And then later on, after this life, God will explain to you everything. So what God is telling the Muslims, don't entangle yourselves in theological argumentation. And when we say Dawa, which is misinterpreted as conversion, it means invite people to the way of God, which is the way of justice, the way of decency. And when you get into theological argumentation, you are demonizing other faiths, and that is not the will of God. So ideally, we have religious groups can advance their interests through exemplary behavior by doing good work, as many Christian groups and Muslim groups do, I believe. They are really helping the needy, the underserved, out of religious obligation. And when we have earthquakes and floods and other disasters, they are the religious groups that are first to come and serve the needs of the people. Whether it is through indigenous, like in Egypt, it's usually the Muslim groups that help in natural disasters, or in Haiti, international religious groups are the first responders to those devastating circumstances. I believe there needs to be an international body that regulates religious work abroad for the sake and the safety of religious workers, because we have, unfortunately now in the post-9/11 era, certain Treasury guidelines that really confuse the issue, because if religious groups want to do work overseas, they have to report certain things to the government. In other words, there is a misperception now that missionary workers, religious international aid workers, are now being perceived as agents of U.S. intelligence or U.S. law enforcement, which reinforces this notion that missionaries are just mopping up for U.S. military confrontations. Case in point is the Gulf War. In the first Gulf War, the whole issue was we're trying to defend the human rights of the Iraqi, of the Kuwaitis, and there were fabrications of babies thrown out of incubators by Iraqi soldiers that led to a fervor to go to war in the first Gulf War. Then in the second Gulf War, there were other points that were used to invoke or used to promote war. But afterwards, Christian relief groups and missionaries in particular were given preferential access to relief in Iraq over Muslims. Actually, there were Muslims who were trying to do relief work in Iraq. They are in jail or they are penalized, whereas Christian groups are given preferential treatment. That double standard, if only a perceived double standard, makes that point that we are endangering Christian workers in the way the policy is being conducted. Therefore, I believe that an international code of consensus is important. The last thing I would like to say is that for religions, I believe that the best way to spread the word is to spread the word to your own people first. If Muslims become better Muslims and follow the Quran, and Christians become better Christians and follow the Bible, and Jews follow the Torah and the Talmud, then all this problem of religious conflicts and a violation of religious freedom would, by and large, a lot of it would be taken care of. But thinking that you are going to go and convert somebody to your tribe means that you are undermining the whole notion of the concept of the one God, because then God, you are not serving God, you are asking God now to serve you and your team, your football team. You want more people on your team than the other team. So religion was not meant to be tallied into who's on which team. Religion without justice, without a true movement for liberation, without decency, becomes a means of exploitation. So let us remember that the initial tenets of the faiths, all the faiths, especially under the religions of monotheism, is meant to believe in one God, believe in one human family, and to do good work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we rival the Tim Shaw panel on brevity. So thank you for those hard-hitting and smart and terse remarks. Our second panelist today is Reverend Leah D. Daughtry, who's pastor of the House of Lord Church here in Washington, D.C. You've seen her bio a long record of public service and of political service, most recently as the CEO of the 2008 Democratic National Convention in Denver, Colorado, and 6 years as the chief of staff to the Democratic National Committee. And I seem to recall that during that tenure, it was widely reported that she would fine Howard Dean every time he swore, raising money for her church. And I wonder if that's a form of proselytism. We look forward to her comments. Reverend Daughtry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you, and thanks especially to my friend Dr. Farr for his ongoing work in this arena and for bringing us all together to talk about this important issue of proselytism and religious freedom. I'm going to say that you've heard my bio, and to date I've worked on 7 presidential campaigns. And I don't know how many midterm elections and mayoral elections, but I'm first a pastor, 5th generation pastor in a denomination that seeks to actively engage our members in civic activity. So I'm going to talk to you based on my experience at the intersection of those two things, as a political operative and as someone who actively encourages people to share their faith and to be involved in the political arena. I'm not an academic. I'm a pastor, so I'm going to make sure I keep my watch in front of me because, you know, pastors in front of a microphone is a dangerous thing. I want to make three very broad points, and I hope we'll get to have some discussion about this later. First, regardless of our personal religious beliefs or lack thereof, we all engage in forms of proselytism every day. In business, it's called advertising. In the legislative process, it's called debate. In politics, it's called campaigning. And in each case, an entity discusses its merits and the advantages of its product in an attempt to win new customers, supporters, or voters. And there's nothing wrong with this. In fact, we encourage in this country the free exchange of ideas, believing that consumers, given the broadest span of information, are the most qualified to make the decisions that are best for them. When it comes to religion, we call it proselytism, and then we want to change the rules. But I would argue that the same rules apply, and there are instructive lessons to be learned from their application in the arena of faith. It's okay to talk about your product, or your legislation, or your candidate, or your faith. And it's okay to claim that you're the best. And it's okay to talk about the benefits of your product, and it's even okay to share your version of the consequences of not choosing your product. But it's not okay to arrest people because they don't buy your soap. And it's not okay to destroy someone's livelihood because they won't vote for your candidate. And it's not okay to threaten people with bodily harm because they don't adopt your faith. Proselytism is acceptable as long as there is no tangible, material, or physical consequence, good or bad, for the person hearing, accepting, or rejecting the message. The second point I want to make is proselytism is not a dirty word. Rather, in its best form, it is an excellent marker of a free society and must therefore be encouraged. When individuals are able to freely express themselves, including but not limited to the sharing of their faith, and speaking openly about their faith, and when individuals are freely able to make decisions based on their own interests, including but not limited to choice of religion or choosing no religion, you have the underpinnings of a free and open society. To go a step further, a democratic system of government and the political system that supports it are in fact dependent on the ability of its citizens to speak and choose for themselves. Now, while as political operatives, we cannot be in the business of favoring one religion over another, we can support and defend the right of those groups to actively engage in persuasion, as we would call it in politics, persuasion tactics to win folks to their side. And let's face it, every political party in a democratic society wants voters who are able to reason, evaluate, compare, and choose wisely, with wisely being in the eye of the beholder. Now, whether you're the proselytizer or the proselytizee, these are the kinds of people we want, able to make a good argument and persuade others to your point of view, or defend against a reasoned argument and stand your ground, or just listen to an argument and ultimately make the decision that is in your best interests. Now, this is not to say that proselytism is not without challenges, and that brings me to my third broad point. Solutions to the challenges of proselytism, I believe, lie with faith leaders and not with individual adherents. While we may choose to encourage and support faith sharing in societal circles, we must also understand that there must be parameters or rules of engagement in which proselytism is conducted. And these parameters must be understood, adopted, and encouraged by leaders in faith communities. We have to acknowledge that faith leaders have enormous influence within their communities, and it is through it they are conferred the ability to engage their individual communities for good or for bad in the right way to proselytize. This represents for us a shift from the normal retail politics in which the target audience is the individual. and engagement with community leadership is done merely out of respect. While individual adherents are certainly a key component of proselytism, faith leaders are critically important in any discussion about appropriate engagement tactics. They hold the key and are the difference between the fair and open sharing of one's faith and the coercive, punitive, exclusionary tactics that can make a society unlivable and ungovernable, and ultimately lead to a loss of religious freedom for everyone. I'm going to stop there. This is a record for a preacher. I'm going to stop there and leave and go to my colleague, and then we can have some more discussion later. Thank you.
Wonderful. I see that many of you are taking notes furiously. I think there's going to be an avalanche of questions when we come to the question and answer time. Our third panelist is Matt K. Richards, who's a shareholder at a Salt Lake City law firm. He's also a faculty member, a fellow of the International Center for Law and Religious Studies at Brigham Young University. He is a published author. There's more in his bio there in front of you, and I'm going to turn it over to him at this time. Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Tom, and also for being able to be on the panel with these guests. You know, it's an interesting debate, isn't it? And some of what we're talking about here in this panel is a reaction to the questions that were posed to the last panel. So I think we can comment on that a little bit as well. In fact, one thing that struck me from the earlier panel is that the focus of that discussion was on what the different faith traditions, what their obligations are or are not with respect to proselytism. And to me, whether or not a faith tradition encourages proselytism, those arguments are convincing to those who hold the same tradition or a similar tradition. But to me, the basis of whether or not what the borders of acceptable versus unacceptable proselytism in a larger pluralistic society really are rooted in human rights. And I think that's where our dialogue needs to be in terms of how we form policy decisions. Because I don't think we can talk about the borders of acceptable and unacceptable proselytism without understanding the underlying human rights that are involved. And I appreciate what Richard Land said about the human rights earlier today. Because there is an inherent conflict between the right of religious liberties, which include both the right of expression and the right of manifesting one's beliefs and religion, and also the right of the person, the proselytizee, to make an informed choice to understand and to accept or reject the message that's been presented, and then, of course, to change or adopt religion if that's their view, or to stick with what they've their initial views. And so that's on the one hand, and then on the other hand is the legitimate need of governments to regulate and the interests of others, including indigenous populations and rights of privacy, and frankly, just the right to hold opinions without interference. So we have those conflict of rights, and how we, as a policy matter, define the border between acceptable and unacceptable proselytism come down to how we pair those competing rights together. And for 4 reasons, I submit that the balance should be in favor of free expression and free informed choice. And that comes down to, first, that the rights of expression and manifesting and the right to choose of the target are both sides of the same coin, and that coin is the freedom of conscience, which underlies everything. As Ms. Daughtry said, it is the foundation of a democratic society. It's the ability for us to function, and that is fundamentally a protected human right under the international compacts and the Declaration of Human Rights. And it presumes a robust marketplace of ideas. One can't choose or speak or can't choose among a palette of different options without having those options available and presented. And on the other hand, the right of religious worship and manifesting and of expression is meaningless unless one can express firmly held beliefs. And proselytism is a form of speech that offers choices. The second point is that religious persuasion should be protected like other forms of speech, and we've heard a little bit about that earlier, just a moment ago. And speech, expression, should not be limited by subject matter or the speaker. The third point is that regulations that restrict the ability to proselytize from a religious view or a belief often favor a dominant religion or a dominant ideology. And at a fundamental level, when they're not going to protect health and safety, but if the regulation is intended to restrict the palette of choices that one can choose from, then those regulations are a form of proselytism themselves, and in some ways they're paternalistic because they limit the choice that's offered to someone. The target, the proselytizee, needs to have the opportunity to choose for him or herself. And then the last point, which I think underscores the reason of why the balance ought to favor the expression in the marketplace of ideas, is that just as Dr. Daughtry mentioned, we are accustomed to making those kinds of choices. We routinely do it in all facets of our life, and we ought to be able to do the same in our religious and life stance choices. Of course, some restrictions on proselytism are necessary for the preservation of health and safety, preserving the freedom of choice. If European Court of Human Rights cases demonstrate that it is appropriate to make some limitations on proselytism in order to preserve the rights of freedom of conscience, for example. The Larissa's case is an example of that. In that case, there was in a military hierarchical society, superiors were proselytizing those under their direction. And the court held that that was improper because of the circumstances that removed the freedom of choice on behalf of those who were being proselytized. And so there are legitimate regulations in those circumstances, or similar circumstances. There are also, it may be possible to have time, place, and manner restrictions. However, restrictions should be narrowly focused and tailored. And it's exceptionally difficult to do that, to tailor it in onto what defines, for example, coercion. There are different points of view about what constitute coercion. And I'll give an example. In the Kokkinakis case, Kokkinakis versus Greece, which is another European Court of Human Rights case, there's a majority opinion, and then there are opinions of the judges who didn't prevail in that decision. And the court held that the tactics of the Jehovah's Witness were not coercive, and so they didn't constitute proselytism. That was inappropriate. But on the other hand, the minority judges rather stridently said that those teaching tactics, here the Jehovah's Witness went into a person's house, stayed about 10 to 15 minutes to express a message, but the minority judges held that was coercive. It was a rape of the conscience, and that's a quote, and so rather strident in those views. Another example of the difficulty of coming together and expressing how you define what's appropriate or inappropriate is in inducements. And I haven't heard anybody say that it's appropriate, we ought to be in the position of bribing somebody to join a religious congregation. I don't think anybody would suggest that. So material inducements, direct material inducements I think are approachable. I think everybody agrees to that. On the other hand, there are indirect ideas, and so we've heard today discussions about somebody handing out the $500 check, or we've had, or just the idea that's inherent in any form of witness that we have something to offer that might elevate your life or make it a better place. And that's inherent in any message, that we're going to help you become better. Well, what's the difference between that kind of an indirect inducement, that you can become part of a community, and the direct, more approachable inducement? I think it's a difficult line to draw in some respects. But it comes down to having regulations that that if there is a regulation or some ill to be regulated, it needs to be narrowly tailored. And at the end of the day, policy should favor a robust marketplace of ideas as a fundamental expression of human rights. I want to comment for a few minutes on codes of conduct. To my last count, I've identified 16 different codes of conduct, and these are ethical guidelines that have been produced and are in the process of being produced by a number of different NGOs or ecumenical groups, and the question was raised whether these can be an effective alternative to international regulation. And that's an interesting question, and I'm aware of a study that's going on now, for example, on this issue. And the initial conclusions of that study are interesting, and their view is that the motivation of the code drafter, the people that are putting together these ethical guidelines, largely predicts whether it's going to be a relevant or a legitimate approach. The best codes of conduct tend to be drafted by NGOs that are interested in promoting a debate about this balance that we talked about earlier between the rights of expression and choice on religious matters and beliefs, and then the restriction of those to preserve identities or cultures. The best codes of conduct are rooted in those human rights and relate back to them and recognize and understand them, and then have some guidance in terms of how a faith community can respect cultures, can respect ideas and of others, and promote their viewpoints in a way that minimizes the conflicts. Their role is, I think, I would agree with what Dr. Daughtry said in terms of the fundamental the basis of how one regulates ought to be with the religious organization itself, in terms of self-regulation, at least with respect to these codes that are promoting rather amorphous concepts of respect and sometimes tend to be in the eye of the beholder, and wouldn't substitute as law in the sense that they would be difficult to enforce in a strict way. And finally, talking about the implications of proselytism, on political and economic implications. I think there's a really interesting intersection, and a couple of scholars, I think, including Roger Fink, who I think is going to be on the panel later today, so I won't steal any of his thunder, but I think his conclusions with Brian Grimm and another study by Paul Marshall are interesting in that they note a high degree of correlation between an open society that allows for proselytizing, allows for the free expression and the open marketplace of ideas. There's a high degree of correlation between that approach and economic development and, of course, civil rights in general. And we can talk more specifically about that if that's of interest to you. And then the last point, in terms of what the United States ought to do, the United States ought to continue its role as an advocate of free human rights in general, and the right to engage in proselytizing is an important component of that, but it's one component of human rights, and it ought not to be second best to other forms of human rights. There's no reason, as we mentioned, to treat freedom of expression differently when the subject is religion than when the subject is politics or another issue. And partnering, the United States ought to partner with other groups that are interested in this so that it does not become just an American issue, but it's an issue that ought to be something at the forefront of international dialogue. And I'll conclude there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, we've had 3 stimulating sets of remarks at this point, and I'm going to open it up at this point for questions. We have microphones that are out in the audience, and I just ask 3 things. If you'd please identify yourself. Second, as a courtesy to those around you, if you would keep your remarks brief. And third, if you would frame them in the form of a question so that the panel could respond to you. So, do we have any questions at this point in time?
Hi, I'm Jordan Pendergrass, and my question is, as a student here at Georgetown, I've engaged in religious conversations with English language learners here from the Middle East, and I'm not exactly sure if my understanding of Dawa is correct. Why could I not have those similar religious conversations in their native countries? And anybody could comment, but mainly for the Sarandhian.
Sure.
Please.
I guess that question's directed to me. So it's very simple. You cannot have the same kinds of conversations in the Middle East as you can here because of one of my fellow panelists just alluded to, is because we have an open society here. We have a free democratic society here, whereas where they come from, they are mainly under totalitarian regimes. And I think sometimes we confuse the issue of religion with the problem of dictatorships. And a lot of these issues of persecution come from dictatorships. And the dictatorship, again, represents one group or one person that says, if you don't agree with that person, then you are a threat to the state. So therefore, there is no freedom of conscience for anyone. And the majority of the victims, I would argue, in those countries are Muslims. The majority of the people in prison in those countries are Muslim prisoners who may have promoted a certain religious understanding or a religious point of view that the state considered a threat to them. And again, I point to Iran. There are many Muslim dissidents to the Iranian regime today. And the same for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, all of these countries. There is no freedom like we enjoy the freedoms here today. And that is the main reason why you don't have that same conversation. Now, in terms of Dawa, Dawa in the Quran means invitation, to invite. The Quran doesn't say invite people to convert to Islam. The Quran says, invite people to the way of your Lord with wisdom and with nice admonition and for the purpose of creating something better for society. So that's the context of Dawa. If Dawa becomes, again, a vehicle for imposing or pushing one narrative because it is associated with a power, then that's a whole different set of circumstances, and it's not proselytism, it's not witnessing, it's not da'wah, it's none of the above, it's something different. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there a hand back here on the right? Cole?
Cole Durham from Brigham Young University. One of the things that's striking to me about discussions about proselytism is they have something like the Kokkinakis model in mind. That is, the isolated person who goes out and talks to other people and tries to convert them. One of the things that is never really focused on is what happens after that, because my experience watching my own what happens to people who join my own religious community and people who become Jehovah's Witnesses or any number of others, there's often substantial reverse pressure, call it proselytism, call it coercion, to pull people back. It seems to me that this is the right to persuade people to change back is obviously legitimate, but often the kinds of pressures, there's an asymmetry in talking about these issues, that somehow pressure, if you're the sort of the initial converter or missionary or whatever, is one thing, and then a lot of unstated pressures that go in the reverse direction are not looked at. And there's a lot of coercion ranging from problems that people will have with employment opportunities, various kinds of social pressures, to extreme cases such as the capital offense for conversion from Islam in some countries, in some places. And that, I recognize there are a range of theological views within Islam on that point, but that's a complicated one. So just wonder if the panel could speak to those. I think there are overlooked asymmetries in the coercion and pressure issue. We focus so much on the initial conversion and not on what happens afterwards in reverse pressures. If you
Thank
could
you.
comment on that.
Why don't we start at my left, and we'll work our way this way for anyone who wants to comment. Salam, do you?
Again, I don't want to get into specific country-specific concerns without looking at what the Islamic principles are, because we won't have time to go through all the countries. But I can just talk about this issue of this notion of a capital offense for conversion, or what's called apostasy. And definitely there's a lot of confusion over that issue, including among Muslims. And let me just, again, speak directly from the text. There is no apostasy punishment in Islam. The Quran specifically says those who leave the religion and come back, and then leave the religion and come back, and then leave, in other words, don't keep doing that. Implicitly there is an allowance for people to leave the religion. Now, there are some hadiths, reported sayings of the Prophet that allude to situations where people have left the faith. And let me go into two examples. When it is reported that if somebody leaves the faith, then you have the right to go and kill him. That was within the context of a war where if you converted to the other side, therefore, and leave the Muslim side, that is not religious apostasy, that is treason to the state. And so we have, therefore, different sets of definitions between what we're looking at today and what was taking place at that time. And definitely throughout the Crusaders era, that's exactly what happened. If people converted to the enemy side, that is actually an act of treason that threatened the security of the state. It doesn't threaten the religion. Religion doesn't need protection. Religion will continue regardless of what we do, and sometimes in spite of what we do. So that's one thing. The other example of the Prophet that I think is important, there was a person during the time of the migration between Mecca and Medina, the companions found out that one of the people actually developed a plan with the enemy against the Prophet and wanted to kill the Prophet when he arrived in Medina. And they caught that person. And the Prophet said, "Don't hurt him. Let him go." So here is an example of amnesty to somebody that actually was considered a hypocrite, somebody who was against the faith, converted to the other side, acted in treason, but still the Prophet gave him amnesty. So I think those are the principled examples that we have to talk about. What happens in parts of South Asia or the Middle East, I think, again, is very political, and in my opinion, blasphemy law was introduced into that region during the time of colonialism from British or European systems that do have laws that defend one church or one set of people over the other. And I think that has created a lot of confusion into where this issue of the right of conversion and the right of choice, free choice in Islam, which I think is very clear in terms of the principles.
I would respond to that beginning where I ended, which is the need for us on this particular issue to engage faith leaders, because it's very difficult to argue logically that the same principles of free speech that you want to protect you in your faith and your ability to share your faith openly with others you can now deny to other people when they choose to leave your faith. It's an illogical argument. So I think you've got to almost go back to the leadership of the communities that practice this sort of thing. And I think it happens around the world, and it happens here in the United States in various faith traditions who believe that certain offenses should cut you off from the community. But I think for Christianity is built on the notion of free will and your ability to choose God or not, but that choice is left up to you. And the consequences of not choosing are not mine to mete out. Those consequences are for God to mete out at the time he chooses to mete those out, which in my theology is at the end of days. So I would have a hard time saying to people, do I want to lose members? Do I want to lose people? I think I've got the answer to all of life's problems, and I think if you just do what I believe like I believe, then everything will be great. But I know that's not going to happen. But it's not. It is indefensible for me to argue that if you leave my tradition, then somehow you should be cut off from job opportunity, from life opportunity, from community, and then still I want the protections of the free speech, and I want the protections of being able to proselytize, but then I don't want to. I want to deny those from other people. I think that's problematic, and the only way to really resolve that is through, I think, direct and honest dialogue and continued engagement with the leaders of the community who are able to change that culture. And it sounds I know it sounds very easy and broad brush, but I think that's really where it starts, because it comes from the top down. And if the leaders don't enforce that kind of thinking in their community, then it becomes this trickle-down effect where we're all cutting each other off from each other and cutting off community and meting out consequences that are really not ours to mete out.
I just want to agree with that. I think that it's incumbent on the faith community to be to self-regulate. I think that there's a practical reason for it too, because there are reprisals, and we see that as evidenced by what Salam was saying earlier in terms of how those have come, the restrictions or the anti-conversion laws have come about. But I think we see it today in East Europe, where because of concerns about proselytism, there are now under consideration additional regulations about that. But it has to be. There needs to be parity, and I appreciate Cole's question, because on the one hand we're focused on worries about coercion in the initial proselytism, in the invitation, and I really like Dawa in terms of what it means as an invitation, because that's how I view what proselytism ought to be, an invitation to say, here's what I think, and you have the option to choose to follow that or not. But if one follows that, if one accepts what the proselytizer brings, then there ought to be limits in terms of what the reaction to that choice is, and so that there is a full and ample choice in terms of one's ability to choose the faith or belief or life stance that he or she wants to assert.
Super. Right here.
I'm Dr. Marianne Kuzumanalove from Catholic University and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Very specific question on this line. Where is the line between proselytism and witness and invitation and codes of conduct? For a U.S. military chaplain, perhaps operating in Afghanistan, the U.S. government law says proselytism is not allowed. Yet, is it allowed for him to give a Bible in native languages, in tribal languages, as a gift? At what is the line between personal witness and which is allowable versus acting as an agent of the U.S. government in uniform? Where is intimidation or coercion versus witness?
Well, if I could just 2 points real quickly. Number one, I think we, from an American standpoint, we have to also be very careful in separating church and state. For government now and government officials to be promoting a religion, especially overseas, I think is very problematic. And there have been some indicators of that already domestically. For example, there was I think a Lieutenant Colonel William Boykin, when referring to Somalia, he said it was, I think, something like our God over their God. So that alludes to a mentality within certain parts of the military that creates tensions not only overseas, but among non-Christian or people who are not of that ideology within the military and within our government. And again, in Islam, there's a separation of the ulama and the state, the scholars and the state. So an independent judiciary, independent thinking away from what government is promoting or protecting, especially dominant faiths, is very, very, very important. Number two, the issue of now the government through the military is proselytizing overseas. It obviously creates this notion of, okay, here comes this idea of the Crusaders again, that religion is that Christianity in particular is mopping up for the Crusades in the Muslim world. And this is a narrative that does exist, unfortunately. So we have to be very sensitive to that issue. Chaplains should be chaplains for those in the military. And I think that's the extent of it.
Leah or Matt, any comments on that?
Yeah, I would agree with his comments, particularly as it regards the issue of the separation of church and state. From my view, in the particular example that you raise, if you're a military chaplain, ostensibly when you sign up and agree that you're going to be a military chaplain, you're clear about what the rules of engagement are, and that you are clear, one would think, about the lines in terms of what your responsibilities are. And obviously, if you're a military chaplain, you're not hired to be a Christian chaplain. In some spaces, I do a lot of work in prison ministry, for example, where there are specific chaplains for specific faiths. And so when you go to see that chaplain, you know that what you're getting from that chaplain is a specific viewpoint, because that's what they're hired to be, is the imam or the rabbi or the minister for that facility. If the title and the responsibilities are broader than that than just to offer spiritual sustenance without a particular set of viewpoint, my idea would be that that's clear to you when you sign up, or it should be clear to you when you sign up, and so you have to backbench what your personal theology may be in order to serve everyone, and not be in a position of proselytizing. At the point you cross that line, at the point that you step over the guidelines of what's been provided to you, then at that point it's a problem. And I think you run the risk, you are violating your code, and you run the risk of doing exactly what he said, which is stepping over just pure sharing to a proselytization in a space where it's not appropriate.
I'll just agree that I think it's problematic for someone in uniform to become a missionary too.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to make one extension of these remarks about this issue, and that is that that there's a wider set of issues obviously going on for military chaplains at present, and point you to two publications that you could look at that I think Dr. Love is familiar with, but that perhaps the audience isn't. And since the U.S. involvement in the Balkans, there have been chaplain engagement with other religious leaders as religious leader liaisons. And let me tell a little different story than the one about the Bible, and that is, imagine that you are a military commander, a U.S. commander in Iraq, and you're engaging with local tribal leaders, and they show up for the meeting with their holy man, to use their parlance. And they wonder where your holy man is. Isn't he an important advisor on cultural issues? Why isn't your chaplain there beside you? And the U.S. has been responding to this since Bosnia in specific, but especially in Iraq and now in Afghanistan. And two publications, if you're interested in these issues, one is what's called Joint Publication 105, which is the military document on this. A new release came out in November of 2009. And the second one is that a recent issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs, I think the fall issue for 2009, specifically deals with this issue in many stories, so the theory and the practice in the field. And you could avail yourself of those things. Other questions? Sure.
Alan Wisdom with the Institute on Religion and Democracy.
Sir, would you? Yeah,
Okay. Alan Wisdom with the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Matthew Richards raised the question of inducement. And frequently there are accusations when there are issues of conversion that inducements have been offered. And it seems to me that this is a very difficult issue, particularly in countries with a lot of poverty where there's not a social safety net offered by the government, where people really have to look to communities to support them in difficult circumstances, and often it's religious communities. And so changing from one religious community to another, it really involves moving from one social support network to another. And perhaps one network is going to be much more comprehensive than another. And that makes it much more difficult than in a society like the United States, where we do have a social safety net, maybe not what everyone would want it to be, but most people don't depend on their religious group to support them in difficult circumstances. And religious groups that do offer support tend to offer material support to all people without regard to their affiliation, and it's mainly kind of psychological and spiritual support that is offered just to members of the community. So I wonder if you could comment on kind of that question of inducement, particularly in these situations of poverty without a social safety net.
Matt?
I'd be happy to address that. I mentioned that I think it's a difficult boundary between what direct inducement is and this indirect inducement that just comes as being part of a community. I guess I just want to comment that there's not much motivation on the part of a church to give inducements because there's no incentive to proselytize, I guess, for lack of a better term, freeloaders. Who will be a drain on the religious community. And there might be minor aberrations where a congregation or a missionary wants to inflate membership or for ostensible, success, maybe if they're funding or something. But at the end of the day, there's no institutional interest to ensure lasting conversions by those who will positively contribute to the faith community. So the people that they want, that religious groups want to have join their flock are people who have a long-term ability to contribute. So of course there's a benefit to being part of a community. I know that in my faith tradition, issues of humanitarian aid are separated from any missionary involvement, so that the missionaries are not involved with giving humanitarian aid to remove the perception of inducements, and they're also caretaken even within a community when there's some assistance given on an individual level to make sure that the person being converted is not doing it for the ulterior motive of just of getting some benefit out of it. So, for example, there's an interview given by someone who's not the missionary to make sure to test the sincerity of the conviction of the person being that's coming into the faith. And I think it's important that those issues be separate, but it's a difficult balance, isn't it?
Leah or Salam? I agree with what's already been said.
I agree.
We have agreement on this panel. Great. Thank you for being patient over there.
No problem. My name is Bennett Graham. I work with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. And Reverend Daughtry and Mr. Richards, you both have touched a lot on the responsibilities of faith leaders to accept codes of conduct. And I think that is especially incumbent upon American religious leaders and all religious leaders. But my question is related to two cultural challenges that seem to be more related to in the international context. One of those being the historical problems and really the grappling of history. I think you see this in France as an example. The Headscarf Ban really was presented as an issue where there was a fear that school children were going to be forced to accept certain principles, and in particular, these being principles that were not traditional to France. The other cultural challenge seems to be an American understanding of rights that is based on individual rights versus where most of the world approaches rights in a communal sense. I think a good example of this would be in India, where you see anti-conversion laws protecting communities rather than particular individuals. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on those two cultural challenges that really are more applicable to the international context as opposed to the American domestic model.
I'm thinking.
Okay. I'll jump in. I guess I'd push back just a little bit on the idea. Well, I know that there's a perception that that the idea of individual rights is an American concept, but really it underlies the human rights that have been recognized and ought to be, I guess, more fully accepted in the international documents. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, recognize the innate freedom of conscience, which is, I guess, at the bottom, an individual right. And so one hopes that those concepts can take more full root elsewhere besides just the United States. But in terms of how culture and those rights intersect, there's always going to be a balance. And there are restrictions replete in every continent on the ability to express religion. And those range from restrictions on travel and visas to restrictions on being able to meet together, or the involvement of foreigners in local worship exercises. They include land use type restrictions, and you mentioned the headscarves and religious garb, those kinds of issues. And there's always going to be a conflict there, and there needs to be some kind of a response to that. And I think it just has to come back to these universal individual rights, and or human rights, and we need to make sure that those are present, so that when those conflicts arise, we can resolve them in an appropriate way.
I would agree. There is a delicate balance between the cultural issues, particularly in societies unlike ours. We're very culturally diverse and pluralistic society, and with other countries, it is such as France, they don't have necessarily the same experience, and so it plays itself out as a religious issue, but I think it's really, at its root, is something different from religious freedoms. It's really more about how the country sees itself and how it is going to grow to accept a diversity of culture and a diversity of thought as they move into the future. And you see that in France. They're just not it's a country which has, in the last several years, become much more diverse than it has historically been. And as they live with those challenges which we have had here and successfully, at least to some extent, maneuvered, they're trying to deal with those. And it's taken the face of the headscarves, but it's really something that really, I think, is a deeper issue. And I go back to something that my colleague said about the ideological proselytization, and how is it really about faith, or is it really about trying to coerce people into a homogenized group? And I think that's what we see in other places around the world, where they have not had the challenge of having to work through issues of diversity and issues of pluralism, or cultural pluralism. So it's a very fine line, a very difficult line to walk, and one we have to be careful with as we are engaged with our international partners, and not being paternalistic about how we engage them, and also understanding that they are walking waters that we have already walked. And so we need to be sensitive, while at the same time seeking to protect the human rights of those who have different beliefs and are trying to live their own lives and in the countries that haven't quite caught up with them yet.
Just want to add that definitely, this is why I believe there needs to be international regulations, or at least an international understanding on religious groups and religious activities, especially in what we're talking about, parts of the Muslim world and in other parts like Eastern Europe, because there needs to be a recognition and a respect for the cultural practices of these countries that may or may not have anything to do with religion, and we don't want to create another clash or reinforce the notion of a clash of civilizations. And it's to protect religious groups as well, and their workers. The other issue in terms of France, and I think this is where we need to look at the difference between France and America. I think America's definition of secularism is in my opinion, the right one, in that we are neutral on religion. Whereas in France and in many parts of Europe, this sense of anti-religion, like no religious expression whatsoever, not just for Muslims, but for Jews and for so many other religious groups. Definitely Mormons have quite a challenge in France as well. So this notion of being anti-religion is a form of secular fundamentalism and secular militancy, of trying to homogenize people who are part of French society but are not completely, quote unquote, culturally accepted within French society. So they use the headscarf as really a political issue, becomes politicized. And then it leads to this larger problem of Islamophobia. And we have to look at proselytism and religious freedom, but also proselytism and Islamophobia in how certain groups advance their religious interests and engage in Islamophobia. I mean, when somebody says Islam is an evil religion, or the prophet is a pedophile, and so on and so forth, and you expect that group to go in and everything is, you know, peachy keen, hunky-dory in the region when you insult the religion and the prophet, and then you wonder why there's a clash. We're not really understanding that Islamophobia is a major cause of that problem. And anti-Western, anti-American sentiment and Islamophobia are actually interdependent. There's anti-American sentiment that is proportional to Islamophobia. There's Islamophobia that's proportional to anti-American sentiment.
I just wanted to add, I agree with that. And I think that that's what, you know, the Grimm and Fink studies show too, is there is a high degree of correlation between regulation and then religious persecution and social pressures. And the question mentioned the codes of conduct. I thought it would be helpful just to read one paragraph from a draft code of conduct. This is from the Oslo Coalition. It's a code that's being developed. When coming from the outside to another society, we will be sensitive to cultural differences within that society and adjust accordingly and avoid actions that are considered disrespectful and objectionable in that society, including those defined as such for religious reasons. However, we should not be constrained by cultural norms that are opposed to the freedom to promote and receive ideas. And for me, that expresses the balance.
Before we take this next question, there's a large body of students over here. And so students, after this question, the next question, I'm going to give preferential treatment to a student. If I haven't seen any hands from you, by the way, but if you want to jump into this,
Also,
I'm warning you now.
Mr. Chairman, if they have our emails, we're more than happy to answer questions online as
Wonderful.
Well.
We can make that available if you like. So, right here.
Just 1 second.
Yes, please.
Okay, Paul Marshall, the Hudson Institute. We've raised questions about the possible meanings of the term proselytism. I'd also like to flag the term missionary or mission, because that's another term whose meaning is not apparent. A couple of background issues to this. If I could just give one example. A couple of years ago, CNN had a series of programs called God's Warriors, and looked at militant Christian groups and then says, danger of religion and violence. Well, it proves nothing of the kind. Those are simply the groups you looked at. One could produce a TV program called Warriors and show a whole range of groups and their potential for violence, and therefore demonstrate that human beings are quite capable of violence for any number of reasons. Similarly, if we're talking about proselytism, do we wish to restrict that to things usually defined as religious? Or if we're looking at making this problematic and talking about regulations, would we apply it, say, to feminist movements who are seeking to impact traditional cultures, to environmental movements, to people who want to extend Enlightenment values generally, say to the activity of the French, the Belgians, the Turks, who have aggressive programs to spread secularism, the Belgian government funds lay missionaries of laïcité going abroad. So my concern is this, that I think some of the ways we're framing this, we're privileging a lot of self-proclaimed more secular or Enlightenment views, which are then presumed to be sort of rational and open, and they're free to go. But religious groups, religious groupings are somehow much more dangerous and should be restricted. So that wasn't a question, it was a speech, so I'll make it a question. What do you think of that?
That's a fantastic framing of a related issue that directly relates to this. So why don't I start at my left and we'll come this way.
I think my opening remarks were pretty much in line with exactly what you're saying, that we need to look at all groups, whether they call themselves religious or secular. And it's the practices that are the issue, not the nature of the groups.
I would echo my earlier remarks in my opening remarks that I think we engage in a lot of things that we don't call proselytism, but they are proselytism. It's an attempt to convince people of a point of view, whatever that might be, and we generally use it to apply to faith and religion, but it can be used in any broad number of situations, circumstances, and applications. I'm from a faith community that refuses to use the term missionary, because of the negative connotations that it has overseas, and in terms of many years ago, how indigenous people were treated and how they perceive missionaries in their cultural circumstance as people who came to give them the Bible while they took the land. So in my tradition, if we do overseas work, we would never call ourselves missionaries because we think of it has a negative connotation. I think that in agreeing with my colleague that the government, you have to draw a very bright, neon bright line in terms of where the government gets involved in issues of persuasion and proselytization. And if someone wants to convert, that's quite frankly, none of the government's business. And the government shouldn't be involved in taking note of it, not taking note of it, counting or framing or any of that. It's just we've got to separate church from state in relationships.
I'll just be brief here. I think you've got a resounding amen. We have and to the point that there are lots of other groups that are involved with some kind of what might be construed as a proselytizing effort for non-religious, but maybe more secular purposes. I think that it highlights that rights to religious persuasion are often compromised, even though comparable rights are not. And I think that that's a shame. Just like a person can freely advocate his or her religious or political views, they ought to be able to advocate religious views as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, one of the pleasures of being at Georgetown is our very smart student body. Do you have a question from here? And we attract smart students from other campuses as well.
Very, very, very hospitable.
My name is Allison Foster. I'm studying at American University this semester. But my question is about the international regulations that have been spoken about. And you can't hear me, so I'll say that again. Hello. I have questions about the international regulations you've been speaking about, and I was actually just wondering more specifically what type of regulations you think should be promoted, and like from what frame of reference, whether it should be the UN or the EU or individual governments. And I was just hoping you could answer that more specifically.
Matt, will you start?
Well, I'm not an advocate of international regulation. Rather, I think that that churches ought to be the ones to self-regulate on those points, and communities in general, because it goes both ways. I think there ought to be just rooting in the existing human rights that are reflected in the international compacts.
I would argue for international regulation. I think that voluntary regulation often means voluntary compliance. And for something that has this big of an impact, in my perfect world, I'd love to see governments come together, because in the end, those are the people who mete out consequences to say, here's what is allowable, and come to a common understanding of proselytization, and here's what's allowed and here's not allowed, and here's what we can all sign on to. I think barring that, you have people, some faiths who will agree, some who won't, some, changing definitions. And when we're talking about a world that sees these things differently, it impacts the lives of people and their ability to do mission work or relief work in other parts of the world. I think a clear understanding of what the rules of engagement are would be important.
I agree that there needs to be international regulations, because it only takes a few groups to really spoil it for the rest. And unfortunately, there have been too many stories that are either true or not true, but again, it creates a perception of improper inducements, economic incentives, in exchange for conversion. And it gives also an inflated number of religious conversions. And also, unfortunately, situations of kidnapping, stories of kidnapping at least. And I'm not just referring to the case in Haiti, but I'm referring to other cases throughout the world. So if that is a problem, then for the protection of the religious groups that are conducting themselves properly, I think we need to protect them, and there needs to be an agreement so that governments overseas do not improperly seize the activities of these religious groups that are conducting themselves in a proper way. Short of an international agreement, then we have to respect the laws of the countries. And I know the Mormon Church, I just visited Salt Lake City, they have a strict rule that they only go where they are invited. So you will look on the map where they don't have a presence, because they will only go where it's open to go and preach. Ideally, we do want the free market of ideas, all ideas. Ultimately, that's what religion is supposed to do, because the argument is if you allow for freedom and freedom of choice, then innately in all of us there's that nature to pursue the truth and pursue God. That's what we were all created with, that pursuit of God and what is godly. So creating freedom and free environments is really the objective of governments, of religious groups, and secular groups.
Super. Well, in a few moments, I will invite those of you who still have questions to come forward and to engage the speakers directly during the break. But I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask the last question, and it's the so what question. We've had a lot of interesting comments from the floor and from our panelists, but my question for them in closing is, so what for U.S. foreign policy? What recommendation would you like to make, or what observation would you like to make about what we do well, or what do we do poorly with regards to official U.S. foreign policy on this issue abroad? And why don't I start here, and we'll come this way.
Well, just really briefly, I think what the U.S. does well in is the promotion of civil society as really the first responders and the groups that take care of the needs, and opening space for civil society in countries abroad where there may not be that same structure. There's the government, and there's the people, and there's nothing in between. So the promotion of civil society is right. Number two, I want to go back to one of the points that I think is really the larger question, is not imposing our set of cultural values. And even me as a Muslim American, I have a different set of cultural framework than a Muslim in Egypt, or a Muslim in Saudi Arabia, or a Muslim in Iran. But respecting the different cultures while coalescing around the values of human rights and freedom and justice. Religion without justice is exploitation. So we must keep that as really the centerpiece of what we're working on. And thirdly, we have to debunk the myth of the clash of civilizations, and sometimes this issue of proselytism, of religious charitable giving, when it's preferential to one group over another, reinforces the clash of civilization. And we have to keep that in mind as well as we pursue international regulation, pursue how religious groups are working, and also promote more coalitions of different religious groups working together in common areas of interest?
I would say that I think what we do well is really providing an example of a free and open society where people can choose and live out their faith or choose to not live out of faith, and that we all live together in relative harmony, Tea Partiers notwithstanding. I had to get that in. I think where we can improve is I think we need a better understanding, or we need to take more seriously the role of faith in countries around the world. Increasingly, faith is part of or driving factor in many of the countries with which we are attempting to develop relationships around the world. And I think to the extent that we don't understand that, or we don't appreciate that, or to the extent that we feel that our way of separating faith from politics is the way that everyone else should function as well, it creates a problem in countries where that's not the way, where faith and politics is intimately intertwined. So I think that we've got to do a better job of understanding that and then engaging the various faith leaders around the world, and some of those faith leaders are also government leaders. We have to understand that they are that they are driven by their faith, and for them that's very real, and we can't make a judgment on that. That is their reality, and we've got to do a better job appreciating that, understanding that, and engaging them in a very authentic way, understanding that faith is a foundational part of their existence.
I agree with both my colleagues. And I think it's possible to have that kind of engagement on religious issues, while at the same time not advocating for any particular religious viewpoint. And I think that the United States has a role in, again, targeting back to the human rights, in promoting those as general universal rights that are not just merely American interests. I think it's most effective to do that in partnership with others who have similar ideals. And then just also a recognition that the right to religious persuasion deserves the same regard as other human rights. Thanks.
Well, I thought I might be able to get them to come out on Afghanistan or Iraq or something like that with that question. That did not happen, but you can get them on the break. First, let me just say that in 30 minutes, intellectual sparks will fly in a gentlemanly fashion when we have a discussion or a debate between our own Jose Casanova of Georgetown University and Gerard Bradley of the University of Notre Dame. And there's a lunch provided before that. But before we get there, would you please help me in showing our appreciation to these panelists? Thank you.